The rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. Throughout history, countless empires have risen from the dust, expanded across continents, and eventually crumbled under the weight of time. Civilizations that once shook the earth have been reduced to mere footnotes in history books. Yet, very few have left as deep and lasting a mark on the world map, trade routes, and the destiny of entire civilizations, quite like the Ottoman Empire. For over 6 centuries, this colossal power, spanning 3 continents and dozens of cultures, stood at the very crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, shaping the fate of the world as we know it today. How did a small, struggling nomadic tribe with nothing but horses, swords, and an unbreakable will manage to transform itself into the most feared and respected superpower the world had ever seen? And how, while standing at the absolute peak of its power, commanding vast armies, controlling major trade routes and ruling over millions, was this mighty empire slowly dragged into irreversible ruin? Today we will journey through one of the most extraordinary and fascinating stories in all of human history, the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 1. From Ertugrul's dream to the birth of a state. The year is 1299. Anatolia is a land consumed by chaos and uncertainty, still bleeding from the devastating wounds left by the Mongol invasions that had swept through the region like a storm of destruction. The once mighty Seljuk Sultanate, which had ruled Anatolia for generations, was now crumbling from within. In this power vacuum, dozens of small Turkic principalities, Nonai, Marken Tudiditedi, Donokant, Nondofu, as day boys to Usmai. Babyliks were scrambling for survival, constantly at war with each other and with the remnants of the Byzantine Empire pressing from the west. Among these small, fragile tribes was the Kayu, a modest Turkic clan that had been displaced by the Mongol advance and settled in the borderlands of northwestern Anatolia near the town of Suud. By all measures, they were unremarkable. They had no grand cities, no vast treasury, and no powerful alliances. What they did have, however, was a visionary leader, Osman Ghazi, the son of Ertugrul Ghazi, and the man who would give the empire its name. Osman was not simply a warrior. He was a statesman with a rare combination of military brilliance, political cunning, and moral authority. Rather than merely raiding and plundering, as many tribal leaders of his time did, Osman built alliances with local populations, offered protection to villages, and established a reputation for justice. He attracted not only Turkic warriors, but also Byzantine renegades, Muslim scholars, and merchants who saw in him a stable and fair ruler. His conquests were not just military victories. They were acts of state building. One of Osman's most powerful weapons was the concept of the Ghazi, the holy warrior fighting for a righteous cause. This identity gave his soldiers not just a military purpose, but a spiritual one. Men flocked to his banner from across Anatolia, drawn by the promise of both glory and faith. But Osman was wise enough to know that religion alone could not hold an empire together. He also offered something more practical: land, stability, and a fair system of law. Those who joined him were rewarded. Those who submitted peacefully were protected. It was a formula that would define the Ottoman approach to governance for generations to come. Under his leadership, the small Kayu tribe began expanding aggressively toward the Byzantine frontier. Town after town fell, not always through force, but often through diplomacy and the promise of fair governance. Osman's sons and grandsons inherited his ambition and expanded it further. Within just 50 years of Osman's first conquests, the Ottomans had crossed the Dardanelles and set foot in Europe, establishing a firm foothold in the Balkans. The city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne, was captured and made the new Ottoman capital, a bold statement that this empire was no longer confined to Anatolia. The rapid Ottoman advance sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Popes issued calls for crusades, and powerful European kingdoms assembled massive armies to push back the Ottoman tide. But time and again, these efforts failed. At the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 and the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, combined European forces were decisively crushed by the disciplined, battle-hardened Ottoman army. The message was clear. The Ottomans were no longer a small principality playing at the edges of history. They were an unstoppable force, and they were marching straight toward the heart of Europe. There was, however, one brief moment when the Ottoman rise seemed as if it might be stopped entirely. In 1402, the Mongol warlord Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, swept into Anatolia with an army that dwarfed anything the Ottomans could field. At the Battle of Ankara, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I was defeated and captured, the first and only Ottoman Sultan ever taken prisoner by an enemy. The empire fractured into civil war as Bayezid's sons fought each other for the throne. For a decade, it seemed like the Ottoman experiment might be over before it had truly begun. But the empire proved more resilient than anyone expected. By 1413, Mehmed I had reunited the empire, and the march of Ottoman destiny resumed as if nothing had interrupted it. The Fall of Constantinople, 1453. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire had expanded dramatically in all directions. Yet, there remained one glaring obstacle. A city that sat like a thorn in the very heart of the empire, separating its European and Asian territories. Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, and one of the most fortified cities in the history of the world. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as an unbreakable fortress, protected by the famous Theodosian walls, triple layers of stone and brick stretching for miles. And surrounded on three sides by water, the city had survived dozens of sieges. Arab armies had tried and failed. Previous Ottoman sultans had tried and retreated. Many had come to believe that Constantinople was simply unconquerable, protected not just by stone walls, but by divine providence itself. But in 1451, a new sultan ascended to the Ottoman throne, and he was unlike any who had come before. Mehmed II was just 19 years old when he became sultan, and from the very first day of his reign, he had one singular obsession: Constantinople. He studied the city's defenses obsessively, consulted engineers and military strategists, and commissioned the construction of a massive fortress on the Bosphorus, Rumeli Hisar, to cut off the city's supply lines. Most dramatically, he hired a Hungarian engineer named Urban to cast cannons of unprecedented size, weapons so massive they had never been seen before in the history of warfare. These enormous bombards could fire stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms, capable of shattering the ancient walls that had protected the city for centuries. The siege began in April 1453. For 53 grueling days, the Ottomans bombarded the walls relentlessly. The Byzantines, vastly outnumbered and desperately short of men and resources, fought with extraordinary courage. The city's population had shrunk dramatically over the centuries. What had once been a metropolis of 500,000 was now a shadow city of perhaps 50,000, its grand streets half empty and its ancient monuments slowly crumbling. Emperor Constantine XI pleaded desperately for help from the West, but Europe was distracted by its own conflicts and sent only a trickle of soldiers and sailors. The defenders of Constantinople knew deep in their hearts that they stood largely alone. But Mehmed's true genius lay not just in firepower. When the city's defenders stretched a massive chain across the Golden Horn to block the Ottoman fleet, Mehmed ordered something that seemed impossible. His ships were dragged overland on greased logs, over a hill and relaunched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. It was a feat of sheer audacity and engineering brilliance that stunned both his enemies and his own men. On the morning of May 29th, 1453, the walls finally broke. Ottoman soldiers poured into the city. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly tore off his imperial insignia and charged into the fighting, dying with his city. By midday, it was over. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years had fallen. The conquest of Constantinople was far more than a military victory. It was a seismic shift in world history. The last remnant of the Roman Empire, which had endured in the East for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, was gone. Historians mark this moment as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. Mehmed II, now forever known as Fatih, the Conqueror, transformed Constantinople into Istanbul, the gleaming new capital of a true world empire. He immediately set about rebuilding and repopulating the city, inviting scholars, merchants, and craftsmen from across the known world to come and make it great again. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, was converted into a mosque, a symbol more powerful than any proclamation that a new age had begun. The Magnificent Century, 1520 to 1566. The conquest of Constantinople was not the end of Ottoman ambition. It was merely the beginning of the empire's golden age. Under Mehmed's successors, the empire continued to grow at a breathtaking pace. His grand son Selim I, known as Yavuz, meaning the resolute or the grim, was perhaps the most aggressive conqueror the Ottoman dynasty ever produced. In just 8 years on the throne, Selim defeated the powerful Safavid Empire of Persia at the Battle of Chaldiran, crushed the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and brought the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman protection. He more than doubled the size of the empire, adding the riches of Egypt and the religious prestige of the Holy Lands in a single reign. When he died, he left his son the most powerful empire on earth. That son was Suleiman I, and under his 46-year reign, the Ottoman Empire reached the absolute peak of its power, wealth, and cultural brilliance. In the West, he was called Suleiman the Magnificent. In the East, his own people called him Kanuni, the lawgiver, a title that perhaps captures his legacy even more accurately. For Suleiman was not just a conqueror, he was a builder of civilization. Militarily, his achievements were staggering. Ottoman armies swept deep into Europe, besieging Vienna in 1529, the farthest west the empire would ever reach. sending tremors of fear through every European court. Hungary was conquered. Rhodes was taken from the Knights of St. John. On the seas, the legendary Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, a former pirate turned naval genius, shattered European fleets and turned the Mediterranean into what contemporaries called a Turkish lake. There was no corner of the known world where the name of Suleiman was not known and feared. But the reign of Suleiman was equally remarkable for what was built, not just what was conquered. The architect Mimar Sinan, perhaps the greatest builder of the 16th century, constructed hundreds of mosques, bridges, schools, and aqueducts across the empire. His masterpiece, the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, still dominates the city's skyline today. Ottoman poetry, literature, and art flourished. The empire's legal system, reformed and codified by Suleiman himself, was among the most sophisticated in the world. To live in the Ottoman Empire at its height was, for many, to live in the most advanced civilization on earth. Istanbul itself, during this golden age, was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, home to perhaps 700,000 people of every faith, language, and background. The Grand Bazaar buzzed with merchants from Venice, Persia, India, and Egypt. The imperial palace of Topkapı was a world unto itself, a city within a city, where the greatest minds in science, medicine, art, and philosophy gathered under the Sultan's patronage. The Ottoman court was not just a seat of power, it was a center of culture that attracted talent from across the known world. The empire had reached its zenith. To the observer, in 1566, it seemed the Ottomans were destined to rule the globe forever. But beneath the surface of this glittering golden age, the seeds of future troubles were being quietly planted. Suleiman's reign ended in personal tragedy. Late in life, he was manipulated by a scheming court into executing his own most capable son, Shehzade Mustafa, leaving the throne to weaker heirs. It was a dark omen. History has a way of humbling even the mightiest of empires, and the Ottomans were no exception. How did this invincible superpower, commanding vast armies and controlling major trade routes, slowly drag itself into irreversible ruin? Find out in Part 2 as we witness the dramatic decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire. If you enjoyed this journey into history, subscribe to our channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. Because every civilization deserves to be remembered.